Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's MEERTalk. My name is Kaeza, and I'll be your host. Today, we're hearing from Robert Tulip, and then we'll take questions from the MEER community. After that, we'll open it up to questions from all of you, our live audience. So now, let me introduce you to our guest speaker. Robert Tulip is a member of the steering circle for the Healthy Planet Action Coalition and is writing a book on the proposal for an Albedo Accord. He worked for 3 decades for the Australian government in international development and has a master's degree in existential ethics. If anybody has any questions that come up while Robert is presenting, you can write them into the chat and we will get as many questions answered as possible. Okay, Robert, well, thank you very much for coming to join us, and we're excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Kaiser, and it's a wonderful opportunity to share with the MEER community the analysis that I have come to in terms of climate strategy and what we can do to practically reverse global warming, which really is perhaps the biggest security crisis that we face, despite all of the terrible things about war we're seeing at the moment. The underlying driver of conflict that comes from heat is just something that we're ignoring as a world community, and that we really need to do something about it. And so I'm interested in sunlight reflection as the business case for an Albedo Accord to re-brighten the earth and cool the climate. And so a brighter planet is a public good. So we speak of lighthouses as things that are funded by the state because they benefit everybody. And similarly, the darkening of the earth is dangerous for the economy and society and ecology. And it should be seen as the primary goal for climate stability, that is, to restore the lost reflection that has happened as a result of CO2 emissions, but is now causing more direct warming than the emissions themselves. I've had a chapter for my forthcoming book, or a taster for it, published in this book called Unshakable Leadership, which is an anthology of writings by people with different views on leadership. And I haven't considered myself, or I haven't been recognised in any way as a leader in climate discussions, and yet this proposal for an Albedo Accord is a significant, I would say, suggestion for a practical way that we can come together to safely, effectively govern the restoration of the stability of the planetary climate. So these QR codes, I hope, would work to take you to the US Amazon site. It's just 99 cents. And the strategy is to try and get people to buy it. And it's just a short article which tells my journey through work in international development and a focus on carbon dioxide removal, and asking how can we possibly scale carbon dioxide removal to the size that's needed to actually affect the temperature, and then a realization that sunlight reflection is the most immediate thing that we can do to actually achieve that goal. So the Albedo Accord I conceive as a practical path to cool the planet. Viewing the planet's albedo layer as analogous to the ozone layer. So clouds, ice, snow, and aerosols now reflect 30% of sunlight, but as I've dissolved the albedo layer on this slide, so too the albedo layer is slowly dissolving. And we need to view temperature as planetary infrastructure, recognising that we need to repair the albedo layer just as the Montreal Protocol has repaired the ozone layer. So cutting emissions is not enough. This is a slide I made a few years ago, so it's with earlier data. So historic emissions up until 2022, 670 gigatons of carbon. So multiply that by just over 3 to get the carbon dioxide. And each box there represents a gigaton, which is effectively a cubic kilometre of water. And so all of this is still warming the Earth. That's the excess above pre-industrial. And each year we add about 15 gigatons of carbon. And through all of the effort of the Paris Accord, the agreement was that we would only add another one. So not to reduce that 15, but by 2030 to only add 16 gigatons. And so meeting all the national pledges to the Paris Accord would increase annual emissions by 1 gigaton by 2030. And the arithmetic shows that cutting emissions does nothing about the 40 times larger committed warming of past emissions, which will produce Earth system equilibrium at a higher temperature and a higher sea level. So decarbonisation is marginal, unfortunately, to stabilising the climate, which first requires rapid rebrightening of the planet, and secondly, the removal of past emissions. And another old slide just showing the expectations of optimistic policy projections from Climate Action Tracker. And so we're currently in this space around 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. And we expect that to continue through to about 2050 before tailing off. So it's a recipe for disaster unless we do something to either change this carbon situation or reflect sunlight. Much easier to reflect sunlight than to change the momentum of the world economy. And so net zero emissions, the best outcome. The circus trick, you can have stable plates on the tops of sticks and keep them stable by spinning the sticks. I don't find that a very comforting prospect for the planetary climate. And so in terms of the climate security timeline, my view is that we need to start with albedo enhancement through cooling to rebrighten the planet and reverse extreme weather, biodiversity loss, heating and sea level rise. And only when we've got that stability through the planetary albedo will we be in a position that removal of greenhouse gases will start to also help stabilise the climate. We should be working on them in parallel, but the impact of albedo enhancement will come first. And then cutting emissions is something that is equally important, and yet it doesn't have the urgency. And so this is a reversal of the strategy of the IPCC. Starting off by rebrightening the planet and then focusing on converting GHGs, greenhouse gases, and decarbonising the economy. And I had an article published last year in The Hill, the magazine in Washington, D.C., and it presented this argument that slowing global warming requires an Albedo Accord modelled on the Montreal Protocol. And so why is albedo more important than greenhouse gas removal for climate policy? The problem, cutting emissions and removing greenhouse gases can't stop climate tipping points. Politics and economics make cutting emissions difficult, expensive and slow. The world situation is like a canoe headed for a waterfall. Viable cooling technologies lack the funds, publicity and political support. So the solution, reverse the ICC priority order and put restoring albedo first. A brighter planet can avoid the climate danger zone. Cooling technologies can be quick, safe and cheap. Governance requires an Albedo Accord to fund large-scale solar geoengineering research. And a key argument that I'm presenting is that it needs to be created through private sector advocacy. I'll come back to that. And so governments must cooperate to implement direct cooling measures. The Montreal Protocol I'm viewing as the model that we can apply to protect the albedo layer. So here, this picture from a report, State of the Ozone Layer, compared the impact of the Montreal Protocol against not having the Montreal Protocol, just in terms of the size of the ozone hole above Antarctica. And so you can see Antarctica in the picture, and just how much worse the ozone situation would be if there hadn't been the agreement to phase out ozone depleting substances. So an Albedo Accord modelled on the Montreal Protocol can create a partnership between industry, science and government to cool the Earth. The Montreal Protocol is the best example of a successful, proven model for fast, enforceable global environmental action. It worked because it had global scope, it stayed focused on a narrow technical risk, it built a durable governance machine, it won broad political support, including from conservative leaders and major firms. To my view, that's a major defect of the Paris Accord. And that is the coalition and strategy the world has failed to build under Paris. The Montreal lesson is that good treaty design can manage global atmospheric risk with well-targeted investment based on a bipartisan, business-inclusive approach. So it's remarkable when you look back to that time how conservative leadership from Thatcher and Reagan gave political cover for the Montreal Protocol. So Margaret Thatcher offered a pro-science, pro-market case for environmental protection, pointing to the Montreal Protocol as a model for preventing global harm rather than paying to clean up afterwards. Very different thinking from the current conservative views dominant in politics today. And Ronald Reagan backed the Montreal Protocol early. He framed it as a model of cooperation built on scientific study, negotiations among business and environmental communities and diplomacy. And the US Senate ratified the Montreal Protocol by 83 votes to nil. And some of the themes, protecting customers, brands and investment certainty, quite different from the sort of political strategy that's applied to the Paris Accord. But I see this sort of business-friendly approach as a model for protecting the albedo layer. So different industries, insurance, reinsurance, premiums are not adequate, losses are rising, whole geographies are becoming uninsurable. For banking, asset management, property, credit risk, the wobbling of mortgage books, municipal bonds and sovereign risk, agriculture and food, facing heat stress, water, volatility, yield instability. And so all of these different industries have a direct commercial incentive to remove heat from the system. And the best way to do that is through an Albedo Accord. Logistics, ports, shipping, as supply chains are becoming more under challenge, energy, utilities, grid operators, the whole challenge of grid stability and power prices and peak demand, construction and property, all of these industries, tourism, technology and data centers are all facing major commercial risk from heat. And to my view, the best way to remove the heat is to restore the planetary albedo. So the insurance industry is coming on board with this, with the actuarial report called Climate Scorpion. This thing is in the tail, warning of planetary insolvency, produced by the UK Institute of Actuaries. A couple of cartoons. So for your meningitis, I'll prescribe aspirin and rest. Dr. IPCC can cure Earth fever by cutting emissions. We really need to change the strategy and do something to remove the temperature. Similarly, IPCC is telling us not to worry, that cutting emissions can be enough to mitigate climate change, where the real situation is that albedo loss and feedbacks are causing a lot more warming than new emissions. And all of these factors, ice melt, cloud loss, ocean heat, extreme weather, coral bleaching, and wildfires, are looming as major security risks. We could mitigate these risks with an Albedo Accord, but we have instead a dominant climate narrative that says emission cuts with net zero by 2050 can be enough. And so all of these industries face big commercial risk from the current climate strategy. We need a new strategy, a planetary solvency plan, and recognizing that you can't defend a 20-foot flood with a 1-foot wall. This is a version of the current situation that was presented by Peter Cox, Professor of Climate System Dynamics and Director of the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter, just to give a basis for the analysis of the NASA satellite data, to say that the solar radiation reflection has actually reduced by about 2.5% in this century, which is a very significant reduction. And I put that into an Excel chart to show this 2% fall and to show how the fall is accelerating. This is from the Clouds and Earth's Radiant Energy System data from NASA, the albedo loss. So albedo can be measured in two ways, either the watts per square meter, shown here. So we used to, each square meter on average would reflect 100 almost watts of sunlight out of the 340 watts that are coming in, about 30%. And that's fallen down to 97.5 or so at the moment. This is a more detailed version of this same data. And what I want to do is just show how in the first decade of this century, the albedo fell by 0.15%. This is measured by starting of saying it was at 30%, that is equal to 100 watts. And then in the second decade of the century, it fell by 0.3%, which is double the 0.1-0.5% trend of the first decade. And now it's speeded up again, and it's now more than 0.6% on a decade rate. And so that means that darkening is now doubling every decade. It's like an avalanche that's speeding up, and I really don't know what's going to stop that acceleration given the forcings that we've got in place. And I thank Professor Elliot Jacobson for extracting this data from NASA, it's actually quite hard to get this data. So I really appreciate his work in doing this monthly satellite data. Yeah, what's going to come next? So what James Hansen said, the decrease of albedo since 2015 is equivalent to a sudden increase of atmospheric CO2 from 420 to 530 parts per million in his 2024 paper. So that means that heating from albedo loss over the last decade is equivalent to about 40 years of emissions. And that suggests if 1 decade of albedo is 40 years of emissions, that albedo loss is causing about 4 times as much warming as new emissions. But there are a whole lot of different ways of cutting up this pie and understanding it. And so that's not the language that Hansen himself has used, but that seems to be a reasonable inference from it. And I haven't been able to get scientists to engage on, is this a reasonable way to describe the problem? Now, if this is right, then it's really very dangerous and shows the priority needed for albedo, but it needs a lot more debate, peer-reviewed analysis. But the situation anyway is that we've got an elephant in the room. There's 2% of planetary darkening this century that can only be reversed by restoring albedo. And meanwhile, the climate action movement has this banning fossil fuels, which is just not feasible and practical as a climate strategy in a situation where loss of clouds, aerosols, ice are causing more warming than new emissions. I quote Nate Hagen. He recently said it's more important to be effective than to be active. And so I think to be effective requires a sound strategy, and that's hopefully where I see the Albedo Accord as a useful strategy. So we're in a major emerging planetary security crisis: extreme weather, sea level rise, biodiversity loss, systemic disruptions, social and economic impacts, and an Albedo Accord can enable urgent coordinated international action to stabilise and restore planetary reflectivity. So, a strategic policy pivot providing vital time to adapt with measurable and acceptable interventions, shared responsibility to deliver effective cooling. Global thinking as a theme I find really interesting and important as a new way to approach how we relate to our planet as stewards, and just as a practical incremental evolutionary approach, viewing temperature and albedo as essential planetary infrastructure as a path towards peaceful cooperation. I see the Albedo Accord much more as a source of peace than of conflict, contrary to much of the negative rhetoric that we hear about solar radiation management. So a focus on albedo could, if we took the example of stratospheric aerosol injection, which is the most feasible cooling strategy, if we added 15 million tonnes of sulfur dioxide to the stratosphere every year, this peer-reviewed paper I found really interesting, showing that if we started in a decade, then by 2070, essentially, we could bring temperature back down to pre-industrial through the addition of about 20 million tonnes of sulfur dioxide to the stratosphere. And that is a way to walk back from the precipice. I've commented that we're in a sort of Wile E. Coyote moment where the coyote is chasing the roadrunner and has already run off the cliff and is looking down and is wondering what to do. But that's a bit alarming. I want to also emphasise this point that the Royal Society estimated in 2009 that the cost of cooling using solar radiation management is only 1,000th of the cost of achieving the equivalent cooling with emission reduction, which is an extraordinary ratio, and it opens the question: why is it that this remarkable, cheap, fast, effective method is effectively banned in climate discussion? This is another famous diagram showing from the late Will Steffen from 2018. And the trouble is that with business as usual, we're headed for a hothouse. If we just remove greenhouse gases, then we're still headed for the hothouse, just a little bit slower. And if we need, in order to achieve a stabilized Earth, we need to reflect sunlight. So the Albedo Accord is a way to step back from the dangerous hothouse precipice. So an Albedo Accord could be fast, safe, scientific, cheap, popular, effective, reliable, and equitable. Industries who stand to benefit: insurance, banking, shipping, agriculture, tourism, defence, energy. What's needed is an industrial lobby to support governments to build a first-mover political coalition of vulnerable countries, to engage civil society, promote scientific advocacy, design and evaluation of technologies, and leading to rapid deployment of an Albedo Accord. And the first task under an Albedo Accord would be to define structure and objectives, explain the benefits, lobby for funding, build a coalition. So aiming to coordinate scientific R&D, model and test proposed methods, manage safe and effective deployment, monitor, review and verify under transparent and accountable governance. And this lobbying impact is just really decisive, that serious political messaging is a highly specialised discipline requiring significant funding as the precondition for effective albedo action. And the corporate sector is more capable of delivering that than the community sector. I wanted to show this picture of all of the different types of clouds, because I see the clouds as really central. And uh, these stratocumulus clouds over the world ocean are heating up. And as a result, there's this lid of warm air. I've drawn this on. And what's happening is that the lid is dissolving under the pressure of this heat that's coming up out of the sea. So these clouds are also dissolving, and what that means. This is a chart from James Hansen showing that of the contributions to reduced Earth albedo, clouds are 62%, snow and ice are 9%, and aerosol forcing is 29%. And so I'm particularly interested in this cloud feedback as a primary driver of global warming. This is another picture I just really like, showing where the main clouds are. These are the ones that are targeted for marine cloud brightening, which could be another major technology to restore planetary albedo. And as these are the stratocumulus decks that are dissolving as the water underneath them is getting hotter, have fallen by about 2% this century as a main driver of the loss of albedo. Now, this is another well-known chart. I've redone this chart actually, because this is, as you'll see here, the latitudes are equal, and I've changed it to show 30 degrees as like half the Earth is within 30 degrees of the equator. So this section here, what it means is that as these blue and grey areas get bigger, the world gets hotter, and so this has been measured by NASA, and it's a really valuable quantification of how the loss of clouds is driving planetary heat as the tropical dry zones are increasing over the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Our colleague Jean Fry produced this really interesting chart of the loss of clouds, and here's another picture. We try to deal with climate change by cutting emissions, and we say that there's a moral hazard involved in restoring albedo. And so the IPCC is telling us that we can't use water bombers because they might undermine support for hoses as a way to deal with wildfires that are threatening neighbourhoods. Leon Simons, one of the best climate thinkers today, has shown that the Earth energy imbalance increase is trending worse than the IPCC scenarios. But experts recognise that solar radiation management, sunlight reflection methods are needed, but they strongly disagree with deployment. So I just question the wisdom of these experts in terms of their understanding of our political situation. And so once again, I've got this introduction to the Albedo Accord published last week, and I encourage you to buy it, to push it up on the Amazon bestseller list, just 99 cents for the Kindle edition. And I'll conclude there, and thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you so much, Robert. We're going to bring on a couple of people from the broader MEER community who are going to ask you some questions. And just a reminder to everybody in our audience that you can send any questions you have in the chat. I'll first introduce and welcome Paul Gamble. Paul Gamble co-founded Nori, the first carbon removal marketplace, and served as CEO from 2017 to 2023. An early pioneer in carbon removal, he helped establish it as a distinct industry category and led Nori to sell the world's first soil carbon removal credits. After a decade building financial infrastructure for scaling carbon dioxide removal, Paul now writes at Inevitable and Obvious about the hard lessons learned in carbon removal and why cooling interventions are essential for buying time while carbon dioxide removal reaches the scale climate science demands. Thanks for being here, Paul.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for that presentation, Robbie. I know you and I have talked before. We've interacted a lot online. You were my questioner for my mirror presentation, so I'm glad to be here participating with you. I essentially agree with everything in there, and I think we went on a similar journey in terms of understanding that carbon dioxide removal cannot actually reach the scale necessary or move fast enough to deal with these worsening problems of Earth's albedo. And I admire the notion of comparison to the Montreal Protocol. We all know that that is like by far the most successful international agreement dealing with atmospheric pollution in that way. My question is more about of like you don't need to convince me and probably not any of the audience here on the necessity of something like this. And my question is more about what do you think are the pathways from here to like a full-on implementation? And when you envision an Albedo Accord, do you envision it being similar to something like Montreal or Paris, where you've got essentially all of the countries of the world signed on to this, or is it more like a smaller multilateral coalition? Um, what can and then I guess to add into that, what conditions do you think need to exist in order for that to happen? Like Montreal was response to very specific identification of ozone hole issues. There was a clearly identifiable culprit in CFCs, and dealing with it didn't require like this kind of zero sum economic kind of approach in the way that like CO2 would. Those are my sort of practicality questions of how do you think we actually get there from where we are today?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Paul. These are really central uh, tactical strategic issues. And I would say that the model of the Montreal Protocol is in the coalition between industry, science, and government. And yes, it's true that warming. You can say that warm. And what happened with the UNFCCC was that people saw the success of the Montreal Protocol and then said, okay, that worked for CFCs, let's try it on carbon. And unfortunately, it didn't work. Uh, and because the there are the substitutes for carbon that there are for CFCs. And so fixing the carbon problem is eventually necessary, but it's just so much more difficult than fixing the CFC problem, which the big industries, DuPont and so on, were able to get on board with substitute technologies. So then, when you raise the question, okay, if the Montreal Protocol doesn't provide a useful analogy for the Paris Accord, perhaps it does provide a useful analogy for reducing planetary albedo. And so, can we legitimately view the planet's albedo layer, that is the uh, collapsing uh, clouds, ice, snow, and aerosols, as analogous to the collapse of the ozone layer? And I think that that's a completely legitimate way of putting it. And so it does show that what's needed is a first mover coalition. That is, the nations who are most affected by climate change and who are switched on can come together to to recognise and lobby for the need for an albedo accord. We had Switzerland and Monaco present in the United Nations Environment Programme a call for just research into sunlight reflection, rejected by the UNEP, showing the poor status of this whole scientific analysis due to the very aggressive lobbying against it, which I believe is a disinformation campaign. And so the question is, how can the first mover coalition come about? And I think that the starting point is to identify the industries who have a commercial interest in removing heat. And this is why I put insurance number one, and say that if they can stump up the money, I think Paul Weinrab has come up with a really good idea, the climate moonshot, saying if we can raise $10 million to advocate for a climate moonshot, and I see the governance of a climate moonshot around an Albedo Accord as the decisive step needed. So if we can get private sector funding to create a lobby, then that is the precondition for convincing governments. And we've had positive indications, like the government of Iceland has recognised AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation collapse, as a national security crisis. And I'm not sure if that's the exact term that they've used, but they're analysing it, as are the Nordics, in terms of the impact on national security. And given the clear scientific evidence that only albedo restoration can slow the AMOC collapse, I would say that we're likely to see this first mover coalition come into place quite quickly. But there needs to be significant money for it. And so that's why I'm writing this book, to say if I can set out the case in a clear way. I'm just getting my ducks in a row to put the chapters of the book up on Substack and create a website, rebrighton.com, as a sister website to our rebrighton.org, just targeted to publicise the book on sunlight reflection. So thanks very much, Paul.
Thank you, Robbie.
Thank you so much, Paul. So next we'd like to bring on John Nissen. John holds an MA in Natural Sciences from the University of Cambridge and worked as a software and systems engineer, contributing to the UK's first digital telephone switching system. In retirement, he turned to climate science, viewing the Earth as a complex system shaped by feedback processes. Concerned by the rapid loss of Arctic sea ice, he co-founded the Arctic Methane Emergency Group, AMEG, in 2011. He later founded the Planetary Restoration Action Group, PRAG, focused on restoring the planet to a safe and sustainable state. So thanks very much, John, for coming to be with us.
Hello. Yes, thank you very much, Robert, for your presentation. Very good, and I agree with everything you said, just as Paul did, I think. I share Paul's fears about using the Montreal Protocol as a close analogy, because I think there were much fewer political objections to setting up the Montreal than there would be to an Albedo Accord. And really the biggest obstacle is from the existing climate experts, the lobby. There's a huge momentum behind emissions reduction. And these people's jobs and careers and reputation depends on their strategy being accepted, and to suggest something like SRM, which is kind of cooling intervention, undermines their case, and they all fight it. And they've been fighting it on two fronts. One is by saying that that their strategy is going to work when it isn't, and that the climate crisis hasn't arrived yet, when of course we know it has, because there's an acceleration in climate extremes and an acceleration in sea level rise. Everything's going the wrong way, and the planet's heading to away from the Holocene into a much warmer place, possibly out of the Quaternary period altogether. And this is potentially a colossal change, and nobody really wants to believe that it could be as bad as that. But the science is pointing in that direction, and the evidence is piling up that things are getting worse, and there's an acceleration in that.
Mm.
So they want to. The climate people want to reassure people it's not as bad as that. That their zero carbon emissions or is going to be sufficient when we know it's not, and they want to. They don't like SRM because and climate cooling intervention because it's like an admission of failure that they failed to deal with climate change.
Yeah, look, John, if I could jump in and reply,
yeah.
We've worked together in Prague for a few years, and I've really appreciated the leadership that you've shown on the Arctic, and so I see the Albedo Accord proposal as building on that really valuable analysis of the melting of Arctic ice and snow as a primary risk to the planet that you've really highlighted. And we see that not only the climate science community, but also the commercial world has seen the melting of the Arctic as a business opportunity in terms of mining and shipping. And so we do face a big challenge in convincing the fossil economy of the legitimacy of the need to refreeze the Arctic as a climate strategy. So, and at the same time, as you rightly point out, we've got the climate science community who have this strange sort of incentive to focus on emission reduction alone as a climate response, even though, as I pointed out, the Royal Society has said that if our actual objective is cooling the Earth, then sunlight reflection can do so for 1,000 times cheaper than emission reduction. So there's a whole series of obstacles, and this is why I think it's important to say, how can we build our constituencies of support? How can we identify our potential allies? How can we assess their willingness to engage? And we face this problem that the climate science community is somehow not really willing to engage properly on climate science. We see James Hansen has been marginalised by people such as Michael Mann, who have dismissed Hansen's analysis without explaining why, other than, as Hansen points out, for just ad hominem fallacious reasons. So we do face this pretty weird psychology of wondering, why is it that the most effective solutions are marginalised, and how can we understand the causes of that? Now it's like an exercise in sociology to interpret that, but I suppose I'm focused on the positive work of saying, let's identify the potential partners, such as the insurance industry and the other affected industries, agriculture and shipping and so on, and say, let's try to mobilise the money that can build an effective advocacy campaign, and I suppose not worry so much about the opposition as like not trying to convince the opposition, but trying to convince the general public and politicians of the priority of albedo restoration, and then happily engaging the scientific debate, which has just been really suppressed so far. Like, you've had this frustrating situation of presenting scientific information and just being ignored. And you and I aren't in a position to exercise political influence. We need to build the political constituencies of people who have the power and the money, who can really change the debate. So, yeah,
Yes.
great point, John. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. You've said a lot of things that I'd have liked to have said. And I really appreciate your point about trying to get somebody interested who can actually provide the funding for to get a real movement going. I mean, I don't have access to funding or any people who fund, but perhaps we can find somebody in the in industry or somebody who's altruistic, one of these wealthy billionaires who wants to find the most effective way of using his money. I mean, nothing could be more effective than cooling the planet. That would be brilliant. And I think we need to besides kind of producing the stick, which is how dreadful the direction is that we're going at the moment, there's a possibility of restoring the planet to a much more hospitable place than it's becoming. We can reverse climate change, we can slow the sea level rise, and reduce the trend, reverse the trend toward more extreme weather, which is actually perhaps the thing that's crippling people most, because it's not the actual base temperature, it's the extremes on top of it that are causing crops to fail and people.
And I think, John, what that illustrates is that sunlight reflection actually is a major moral cause, because our situation is that we're in the middle of the 6th planetary extinction, and we're facing biodiversity collapse on many fronts. And what we need to do is immediately remove the heat in order to protect all of the animal species that are facing extinction due to human emissions. Now, cutting emissions is not going to make any difference. So I just need to turn this off. So that means that the fact that the climate science community is rejecting the most feasible climate response, that they are morally culpable for that. And so that's a debate that I would love to see come into a bit more prominence, and also get engaged with the mainstream media. Like, it was great that you were able to get a letter published by the Financial Times, even though they edited it in a way that sort of diminished the urgency. And this is about the melting of Greenland as a really significant problem that people should be very worried about. So, yeah, thanks, John.
Thank you, John.
Okay.
Thanks so much. So we are now ready to invite some questions from the audience, and we'll just start right now with Martin. And Martin is asking, given the facts about the future of climate change, why do you think it is so extremely difficult to get people, even professional climate scientists, to support a project, for instance, like MEER or other projects that are focused on albedo?
I actually feel that there's a conflict of interest within the emission reduction industry, within the renewable energy industry. And the problem is that for 30 years, the world has been told that energy reform, that is switching from fossil fuels to wind and solar, is a climate strategy. And but and so there's been so much political capital invested in that strategic vision that people have said that if we do anything different, then we'll undermine that logic. And the United Nations in 2021 said that the primary climate response should be to cut world emissions in half by 2030. Now, as noted in that graph that I showed, emissions have continued an inexorable rise. There's been a failure of emission reduction in this decade, and yet what's happened is that the subsidies for the renewable energy industry are dependent on this dubious claim that these subsidies serve to limit climate change. So we've had essentially a popular mythology that is a mass delusion, and we're like the mice while elephants are dancing. That is, on one side, you've got the whole fossil economy, which just ignores climate. It's just they're not outright deniers. Like there are a lot of outright deniers, but they're more climate ignorers because it's too complicated for them to integrate climate into their whole world paradigm. And then on the other side, we have the climate action community, who essentially are saying shut down the fossil fuel industry. And so the fossil industry has reacted to say, well, but that will end the economy. It'll destroy everybody's prosperity. So that's just stupid. And so you've got a paralysis, a partisan polarized paralysis of the public conversation. And so we're stepping into it with a third way and saying, let's leave that partisan debate behind. Let's find a new partisan approach, which is another great feature of the Montreal Protocol, as I pointed out, bipartisan support and scientists working together with business. So it's a great question from Martin. Why is it so difficult to get scientists to support projects like MEER? It's because when their whole tribal community is invested in the idea that we must halve emissions by 2030 in order to address climate change, then anything that undermines that vision is viewed as a moral hazard. So it's this moral hazard debate that has said it's a distraction from the real agenda. But as I've pointed out, heat is the agenda. And so carbon is obviously the main cause of heat, but it's too slow to actually do anything about it. We face these tipping points. So we need a paradigm shift. Okay, so Martin, in my academic studies in existential ethics, I found this whole study of paradigm shift one of the most fascinating things, going back to Copernicus, discovering that the Earth orbits the Sun, Darwin, that the Earth, extending to the theory of evolution, the rejection of young Earth creationism. So there's, these deep psychological, even religious sentiments that still affect how people think, even though, one of the modern religions is follow the science. This mantra from the emission reduction community, but they're not following the science. They're hypocrites, and so pointing out that hypocrisy is a really important challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I suppose people just grip on to what they think. I mean, that's why we still have people who actually believe that the Earth is flat. There are some. As you just mentioned about, that heat being the worst. Excess heat, this is a question from Eduardo. Excess heat absorption rather than CO2 itself is the core issue driving warming. And that albedo restoration could provide immediate cooling benefits. So why not do it where it will have a multiple effect? For example, painting roofs white can reduce urban heat, lower air conditioning use, and prevent heat-related illness. Carbon capture and storage dominates the narrative, and cool roof technology is inexpensive and widely available. So you've kind of been saying about addressing the
Look,
heat.
yeah, so it's about orders of magnitude. And as I pointed out in that chart from James Hansen, the urban heat island effect doesn't even rate at the global level as a source of darkening of the earth. And that's surprising for us who live in urban heat islands. But there are so many scientific discoveries that are a bit counterintuitive, and we have real trouble understanding orders of magnitude. So clouds, 62%, snow and ice, just 9%. That's surprising for those who like John Nissen is a big campaigner for snow and ice as the main agenda in restoring the Arctic. But if the tropical clouds are causing 5 or 6 times as much darkening as the loss of snow and ice, then I say, the clouds are the big issue. And then, of course, the loss of aerosols with the culpable decision of the International Maritime Organization to remove sulfur from shipping. Now, justified on health grounds, but completely ignoring the severe security impacts of heat that are the masking, the fact that these sulfur aerosols have been masking the heating, and so by cutting emissions, we're actually unleashing a major geoengineering experiment. So against all of those, painting roofs white is great at the local level and for environment, for air conditioning costs. But as far as actually affecting the climate, it's not at the order of magnitude to contribute. It has a further valuable psychological and political benefit of helping to educate people. And I really want to shout out to Tao and MEER as leaders in climate analysis. And I think MEER's work in Sierra Leone is fantastic. Like, I had a career in international development, and the idea that, shanty towns or, informal housing can put mirrors on their roofs as an alternative to air conditioning is something, as so many of these tropical countries face escalating temperatures. They're becoming unlivable. And so as a humanitarian project, it's really up there with the best. And it's a way of engaging the debate so that we can enter the global thinking that's needed to reduce heat. And this is where clouds and aerosols and snow and ice are the big game.
Yeah. Well, we have just a few more questions. So Jeff is asking, because I know you mentioned a couple of SRM, solar radiation management strategies. What solar radiation management strategies do you propose, and in what time frame? We'll start first with this, or is it we should just do SRM any and all? Yeah.
Okay, so an Albedo Accord would provide a framework to govern the research and testing and deployment of technologies. And I think it's essential to be technology agnostic. That is to say, we still lack the full information on the feasibility of different technologies, and that significant field research programs are needed to make those decisions. So David Keith, one of the leading geoengineering researchers, he had a paper saying that $2 billion worth of research into technology options could prevent $10 trillion worth of climate damage, which is a benefit cost ratio of 5,000 to 1. So it appears that stratospheric aerosol injection is the most feasible and effective strategy. There are questions about its side effects. My sense is that those side effect assertions have been blown out of all proportion for political reasons, for those who wish to just continue the failed emission reduction alone strategy, and so grasp at any straws to prevent action. But those questions can only be resolved through effective field tests. And so I'm also a very big fan of ocean iron fertilization. I think, again, the risks of that have been blown totally out of proportion for political reasons. I really condemn the London Protocol for the fatwa, the ban that it's placed on ocean iron fertilization. I think it's deplorable and should be reversed. Then other technologies, marine cloud brightening has not yet been proved as like just getting the salt to be small and uniform enough to achieve the results at an acceptable price. My thinking is that it's going to be like the COVID vaccines, that although hopefully without the side effects, that is by throwing a lot of resources quickly into something like a moonshot, that you can rapidly answer these questions about is it feasible, is it safe? And so I think the model is the pharmaceutical industry, the safety and efficacy of drug trials. And so governance has to come first. That is, there has to be a coalition of first mover countries, vulnerable nations who can fund the research and proceed in the face of objections, and proceed with the advocacy and the public information, and proceed to a rigorous testing and deployment program. And so I also want to challenge the views of many in the academic sunlight reflection community who keep saying that they're not sure if it's needed. Well, of course it's needed. Like, you can't have 8 billion people on the planet with 4 degrees hotter. It's just not going to work. And the only way to stop the planet heating up is sunlight reflection. So it's like planting a tree. You know, the best time was 20 years ago, and the next best time is today. So it's urgent. We should be proceeding on a path on the expectation that deploying sunlight reflection is essential planetary infrastructure. And if we don't do it, then, you know, it's a security crisis. We're not completely sure what technologies will be best. You know, there'll be all sorts of. I see a lot of debate about rival technologies, and I find that a bit unproductive, because I think what's more important, as I say, is to get the governance framework in place to fund the advocacy and the testing, so that all of these questions can be answered.
Yes, I understand. Here's a question from Jonathan. The idea of naming an albedo layer is potentially powerful for focusing attention. Can you describe in your slide that shows layers where the new albedo layer may be located to best capture its concept?
Sure. Well, there are a few slides. I suppose I should put the slides back up. There are a few slides that touch on this, so I'll just find it. So going back. So I think this one's really important, because these red areas are the big banks of reflective clouds that are dissolving. So that's one really important part of the albedo layer. Then, of course, the sea ice around Antarctica and um, uh, the Arctic is something like 2 million square kilometres from memory of Antarctic sea ice is missing, and then the uh, the aerosols that are diffuse, and I haven't got a picture of the shipping tracks over the North Atlantic, but that's and North Pacific Oceans, but that's a key part of it. So it's not a so we can view these areas as analogous to the ozone hole over Antarctica, and it's obviously it's not a direct comparison with the ozone layer, which is a distinct layer. But I think that in a simplified popular concept, that to talk of an albedo layer, as Jonathan recognises, is a useful way to put it. And again, this is the contribution of clouds, snow, ice, and ships, as calculated by James Hansen. So,
Great. Yeah. Thank you for bringing us back to those slides. Well, I just was wondering, because I think the field of existential ethics is not something that everybody knows about. And is that really, studying that, what initially got you interested in, the earth and inhabitants and so forth, or what was the evolution of your, becoming interested in environmental science, and then also specifically albedo reduction? Did you have kind of an aha moment where it all suddenly made sense to you around that?
I've had a whole series of aha moments. They're also known as epiphanies, a sudden realization of the truth. So I am really interested in religion because, as I mentioned, a lot of the psychology of humanity is religious in nature. So existential ethics, my thesis was on the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who is often viewed as a founder of existentialism. Being and Time, great book, 1926, and so my thesis was on the place of ethics in Heidegger's thinking, his ontology, that his theory of being. And he had a really interesting line, which was that care is the meaning of being. It's one of these obscure statements that when you start to think about it, it starts to make a lot of sense, because what it means is that we understand meaning through how we relate to each other. So care is about interrelationships, about being with other people, being in the world, and so through care, the interactions of connection, we find meaning. And so meaning's not just something that's out there in the world. It's produced by us through interaction and conversation, and what we value, what we prioritize. And so that idea that a relational ontology is quite distinct from the scientific ontology, which is just descriptive. We try to describe the world in a value-free way. But when we start to say, okay, well, what are our values? My sense is that the flourishing of humanity on the earth is a primary value, and so that the meaning of life is the good of the future. And so when we start from that sort of axiom in philosophy, then it becomes a question of how can we achieve that? And that then gets into planetary thinking, the sort of pale blue dot sort of approach that Carl Sagan presented, recognizing the fragility, the sensitivity, the cosmic scale of the Earth in a realistic scientific way. And it's this fragility and sensitivity that, to me, is the big alarm bell for climate change, because our planet could just collapse. It's happened before. the Permian extinction 252 million years ago, 95% of species all disappeared from the Earth, and we're on a trajectory to do that again. And so we need a major paradigm shift to planetary thinking. And so it's that concept of paradigm shift that's been my focus in terms of existential ethics since I was young. I've also picked this up in more sort of esoteric analysis that I won't talk about here. But so there's a whole agenda there. But in terms of the practical case, that means let's get the business community on board with an Albedo Accord as a practical strategy to protect the economy, and then that's a starting point for the whole deeper philosophical analysis about our relationship to our planet.
That's beautiful. Yeah, the economy of care, really. I mean, that connection is where we're at, and if we can't protect that, then we go down. So thank you so much for explaining about your background more too. That's interesting to hear. We're so
I will just
appreciative.
mention, just in terms of my religious interests, I chair the Asia Pacific region for the World Student Christian Federation, and so I find, World Student Christian Federation, it takes a critical approach to religion, which is very distinct from the more evangelical approach that you see mainly in the US. And so I find the conversation about religious reform is one that can also contribute to this whole agenda.
Interesting. Well, we're very appreciative that you could be here and share your excellent slideshow and your idea, and we're hopeful for the success of your book. You want to hold it up again? I think I see it there in the behind you. Yeah. Yes. So wonderful. And
yep, so it's 99 cents on Amazon, which is a bargain. And Amy, it's already achieved bestseller status in some of the subcategories in business on Amazon, and the goal of it is to get people reading and talking. And I was really pleased that my article on the Albedo Accord was placed second in the book, so the editors really liked it, and I hope I get some good feedback, and I hope it can reach out to some of the communities that we're targeting, especially insurance. I've got an interview coming up with Sandy Trust, the author of the Climate Scorpion report. I work with Meta Spencer in the project Save the World. We're doing interviews with various people, and we've got Sandy lined up to talk about how the insurance industry can engage with all of this topic. So really looking forward to that.
yeah, that should be very interesting. Well, thank you for coming to MEERTalk and furthering our climate and environmental education. Thanks very much.
You're most welcome. Thank you, Kaiser.
At MEER, we're working to help educate the public while also developing technologies to help curb the warming on our planet. We invite you to keep learning about Earth's energy imbalance and climate science on our website. We also encourage you to sign up for our newsletter, where we share updates from our ongoing fieldwork and research. And I just want to mention that in our recent March newsletter, I'll highlight our team is preparing for expanded field trials and longer-term monitoring of passive cooling systems in Sierra Leone. At the same time, we are refining materials, strengthening local fabrication capacity, and deepening collaboration with researchers and communities who are central to this work. It's so important to MEER to work with the communities. Here at MEER, we are primarily a volunteer staff, so please do consider making monthly donation of any amount if you've enjoyed being here and learned something. By all means, check out our YouTube channel for previous MEER talks, and you can find us on social media. If you have found being here and learning something beneficial today, then connect with others and tell somebody about MEERTalk. We hope to see you again for our April 3rd MEERTalk when Fred Pierce is going to present. So thanks all for being here. Wishing you well.